All right, well, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here this morning. My name is Rachel Owen. I'm the director and one of the co-founders of Missouri Science and Technology Policy Initiative. We are at the University of Missouri and also a nonprofit organization here in Central Missouri. And our mission is to improve the health, sustainability, and long-term economic growth for Missouri communities and people by connecting science and policy. We're really excited to be here this morning to share our 2021 outlook on science and technology related legislation that's going to be considered at the Capitol. Like I said, feel free to add questions to the chat throughout this presentation. We're soon going to have all of our fellows present, and I'll introduce a little bit more about our program before we get started. So we have two primary programs with MOST, both of them launched in this last year. So first we have our Missouri Science and Technology Policy Fellows program. We have 5 PhD level scientists who are placed at the Capitol in Jefferson City, and they serve as informal science advisors to Missouri legislators. So they help with answering questions from constituents, give some information to legislators about the science related to bills during the drafting process. And then they'll also be there this spring to help testify for informational purposes, which I'll describe a bit more in detail later. And then we also have a statewide network of scientists, which is how many of you probably found out about this event, called the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network, in partnership with the American Association for Advancement of Science. Dan English is our coordinator for that program, and he'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of this call. But we use that network to really help elevate science and policy conversations statewide. We should add to the end of our mission statement, we work to connect science and policy by connecting people. And so we've long known in the academic community that it doesn't necessarily work to just, get people more information without also building a relationship in that process and having dialogue. So throughout what we do at the Capitol and what we encourage scientists to do statewide, we really want to encourage building relationships, finding common ground, and placing yourself to be a trusted messenger when scientific information is needed to inform policy conversations. So through the legislative process, so you likely know that the legislative session began last week at the Capitol in Jefferson City. So our lawmakers are back to make laws between now and the middle of May. Most of the bills have already been drafted. There's already several hundred bills that have been introduced so far. And so now we're to the point where the most effective way to share information with lawmakers is to testify or provide information on bills when they're being heard in committees. And we focus on this for a couple of different reasons. First, it's because this is when legislators are really focused in on that bill. There's several hundred pieces of legislation. Lawmakers aren't experts on all of those. And so when it gets assigned to their committee, they really start to think about that issue and dive into it a little deeper if they weren't the sponsor of that bill. At this time, we also know that the colleagues in those committee members' parties, they go to the committee members when they're seeking information on a bill. And so if we're able to get scientific information to those committee members where the bill is heard, then that really helps to spread the scientific information more broadly within the legislature. And we also, to note, we testify for informational purposes as an organization rather than testifying for or against a bill. And we also encourage our scientific members to do that because then we can really focus on the science and be honest brokers of the information. But of course, that's up to you what you decide to do if you end up giving information to lawmakers on certain bills. But we always testify for informational purposes. So today we're going to hear from our 5 fellows, and they're going to give you an overview of the bills that have been introduced in their topic areas. They're not just going to tell you all the bills that have been introduced. The fellows have also been diligently monitoring the news, talking with members of the legislature and looking at the history of bills so that they know which bills are likely to be considered out of those several hundred that have already been introduced. Between each of their presentations, we will have time for questions, so you won't have to hold your questions till the end. So for instance, after Brittany presents on the education and workforce bills, we'll go ahead and leave time for questions so that way you can speak to Brittany at that time. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat box anytime, and then I'll go ahead and ask them out loud. So if you could submit your questions via chat, I'll go ahead and ask the questions to the fellows in between, so that way we can make sure we stay on time. Okay, so first up we have Dr. Brittany Whitley. She is our Education and Workforce Development Fellow, and I will go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us this morning. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some of the education and workforce development related bills that we expect might move forward during this upcoming legislative session. Next slide. So I just wanted to start off really briefly with outlining how the education committees are organized in the Missouri legislature. So we have a joint committee on education, which is going to have both senators and representatives. The Senate itself has a single education committee that will hear all of the education related topics. The House splits this up into elementary and secondary education and higher education. There's also a subcommittee for education appropriations, and then 2 special committees also related to education that I've listed here. So I think one of the main topics that we can expect to hear a lot about during the upcoming session is going to be school and parental choice. Now, this is something that's been really important in Missouri over the past few years, certainly, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing is a really renewed push to give parents and families the ability to choose the type of school that they want their kids to go to, and specifically related to whether or not the instruction is in person or remote. And so there have been a handful of bills that have been related directly to promoting in-person instruction. One of these bills would tie federal funding to schools who are having either 4 or 5 days of in-person instruction per week. There's 2 other bills that would either create a tax credit or a voucher for students who are participating in remote learning, so that they would have increased resources to choose a different school that was maybe learning in person. In addition to these sorts of bills, we're also expecting to see the standard school choice bills. And so the first I've listed here is open enrollment, or the ability to transfer out of your resident district to attend school in a neighboring district, or anywhere else basically that you could drive to. We've actually already written a science note on this topic, which is available on our website. So if this is interesting to you, I encourage you to check that out. We also expect to see, there's about 3 bills so far related to charter school funding and adjusting the way that Missouri is currently funding the charter schools that it's operating. And then finally, on this list, we have these empowerment scholarship accounts. So these also moved forward. There was passed out of committee last year, and these basically are private school voucher programs that would allow Missouri students to use these funds to attend a private school of their choice rather than their resident district school. COVID-19 has also really brought to light, I think, some of the consistent challenges with teacher recruitment and retention in Missouri, and also how this relates to administrators, so our school districts and our superintendents. There's a couple bills that we've seen about licensing for substitute teachers. During the pandemic, there was an emergency rule created by the State Board of Education that's made it a little easier for substitute teachers to get certified in the state, and one of these bills would make that law moving forward even after the COVID-19 pandemic. We also see that Missouri teachers consistently have some of the lowest average salaries compared to the rest of the country, and these income tax deduction bills for teachers are meant to sort of address that by decreasing the financial burden on our teachers. And then finally, there was also movement last year, and we're seeing these bills again this year, about creating salary caps for superintendents in the state. Another area that I think is going to be really interesting to watch this year regarding education reform is based on competency-based education. So this is particularly exciting because we have these 3 companion bills that have been introduced by a Republican in the House and a Democrat in the Senate. And so one of these bills would introduce a task force to evaluate competency-based education in the state. Another would create a grant program, and then the third would create this Show Me Success diploma program, which would really serve as an alternate graduation pathway for Missouri students. So those who chose to participate in the program could finish their high school as soon as the end of the 10th grade, and then either choose to stay in high school to participate in career and technical education, advanced placement courses, or these students can choose to start college early. And if they do so, they can take about 90% of the funds that would have been allocated to their high school education and use those to pay for their college education. And And then, like Rachel said, there's really no way to give a comprehensive list of all of the topics we expect will move forward in this upcoming session, but I included a couple other really big picture items here based on bills that moved forward last year and priorities of some of the leadership in the House and Senate. We expect to see bills related to college and career readiness in the K through 12 space. These early literacy plans helping make sure that our earliest learners have reading plans and we're identifying when gaps occur early on in learning. We also expect to see discipline policies, especially related to seclusion and restraint. And then finally, the Speaker of the House indicated that early childhood education was a real priority moving forward. And we know that Senator Arthur has introduced a bill in this space that would change the way that we allocate funding for early childhood education in the state. In the higher education space, really the bottom line here is that the main push by both the Department of Higher Ed and Workforce Development and a lot of the public university lobbyists is going to be just restoring core funding levels. And so we expect most of the discussions in the higher ed space to really be based on the budget and making sure that higher education is getting back to at least 2017 funding levels is currently the goal. I also put in a quick note here that the Informed Student Document Act has been reintroduced this year. This also moved forward out of committee last year and would be a way so that students applying to a college in the state could understand what the costs of that school are, what the graduation rates are, and hopefully help them make a better decision when they're choosing their school. And then I just wanted to end really briefly on the workforce and small business related committees that I cover. So there's also obviously several committees in this space and several bills that have been introduced. Most of the bills that I'm tracking fall into this professional registration and licensing space. We expect to see several bills move forward related to licensing of healthcare providers, which Dr. Mueller will probably talk about later during his section, but also architects, contractors, engineers, roofers, really cosmetologists, really a range of different industries that we expect registration changes to perhaps be occurring. I also wanted to briefly point out that there's a number of bills related to public labor unions, and including a bill that would reintroduce right to work legislation in Missouri. This is particularly of note because of the 2018 referendum where Missourians voted against right to work legislation in the state. And so it's unclear how far that will move forward this year, but certainly something to keep an eye out for. And with that, I will wrap up, and hopefully there's a couple minutes for questions. Happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Does anybody have any questions for Brittany? You can type them in the chat. Also, we probably are small enough that if you want to take your turn your microphone on, you could ask them out loud as well. So we did get a question just asking how can the local science engagement network of researchers around the state support you, Brittany?
I think I'm really happy to see that question, and thank you so much for that question. I think that there's a lot of different tools through the local science engagement network. I think Dan will talk about them towards the end of this presentation. But if there's something in any of these areas that's of interest to you, that you're doing research on, that you would like to be a guest writer for, I would highly encourage you to sign up to be one of our guest writers or reviewers. There is obviously so much going on that I have my toes in a lot of different areas, but any support that is possible, I would certainly be appreciated, and I know that holds true for all of the fellows. So being a guest writer, being involved in the local science engagement network to either submit your own testimony or support the testimony that we're going to provide are two of the top things I would say.
Okay. For the sake of time, let's go ahead and move forward. But if you have other questions for Brittany, please feel free to send them in the chat and we can get back to you. So next, we're going to have Dr. Jill Barnes give her legislative outlook related to children, families, and seniors policy.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Jill Barnes, and I'm going to be briefing you all on potential legislation areas as it concerns to children, families, and seniors. Next slide. So the bills discussed will most likely progress to the following committees. This includes the Seniors, Families, Veterans, and Military Affairs Senate Committee, the Children and Families House Committee, and the Joint Committee on Child Abuse and Neglect. Next slide. First and foremost, improving Missouri's foster care system will be among the Speaker of the House, Rob Vescovo's top priorities. House Bill 429 and 430, sponsored by Hannah Kelly, are major priority bills which establish a tax credit for fostering and adopting children. These bills are currently scheduled for committee hearings on January 12th with the Children and Families House Committee. Some other bills to track about foster care and adoption include Representative Ingalls' 2 bills outlawing discrimination against prospective foster families based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or religion, and another bill to ensure that those who have a medical marijuana card are prevented from adopting a child, which is sponsored by Representative Hicks. These bills were referred to committee last year, but no further action was really taken. There are 2 bills that have not been previously introduced before, which include a bill that would require foster care cases to be given priority over criminal cases on the court docket, sponsored by Representative Dinkins, and a bill that would cap out-of-pocket legal expenses for adopting a child at $1,000, which is sponsored by Representative Robbie. There are numerous bills surrounding child care facilities for the upcoming year. First, 2 bills were filed in regards to the maximum number of children permitted in in-house licensed care facilities based on relationships to the operator. And secondly, and this one is actually a really hot topic right now in local news and on Twitter, but prior to the 2021 session, there was a 4-hour committee hearing in November after a series of articles were published about child abuse and neglect in boarding schools. Currently in the state of Missouri, child care facilities are exempted from licensure. They're religiously affiliated. And this means that the Department of Social Services really doesn't know about their existence until a claim of child abuse and neglect is filed. Representative Ingalls, who is the minority ranking member of the Children and Families Committee, with bipartisan support with Representative V, have filed legislation which would require child care residential centers to notify the Department of Social Services of their existence and undergo the routine facility inspections. In regards to women's health, a recent topic area that's been gaining a lot of traction in policy is maternal morbidity and mortality. The maternal mortality rate in Missouri is one of the worst in the nation, and the most recent and only annual report released thus far did not include any information about the social determinants of health, including racism at the system levels. This bill is sponsored by Representative Unsicker and has been brought up in conversation by a few other legislators as well. This bill was filed last session and referred to the Health and Mental Health Committee, but no further action was taken. Additionally, the last session introduced a bill about feminine hygiene products and diapers to not be taxed higher than the food tax. This was superseded by a bill that only included feminine hygiene products, and that was voted due past committee last session. This session, the bill includes the addition of diapers and is sponsored by Representative Aldred and Representative Dahl. So a lot of laws have been passed in recent years to increase protections for survivors of domestic abuse and assault, such as the right to receive therapy, medical care at no cost during the legal process, and increased access to rape kits. This bill would entitle victims of sexual or domestic violence to time off of work for a variety of reasons related to the abuse. This bill has been filed in the past by Senator Shoup, and it was voted due past committee in 2019, but no further action has been taken. And this session, it includes that a person can take leave if the abuse occurred to a family member or a household member. 8 abortion bills were pre-filed for upcoming session, and it's really unsure how these bills are going to progress. However, I did want to highlight 2 of these bills. First, Senator Koenig sponsored a bill that established the SACRED Act, which requires physicians or qualified professionals to present options in person for final disposition of the remains of an unborn child. This was referred to committee last session with no further action taken. However, Ohio has recently passed this bill within their state. And secondly, the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act establishes that any baby born alive after an abortion or an abortion attempt will have the same rights, privileges, and immunities as any other live-born child. So this has been struggled to be passed at the federal level. However, some states have passed this act, and 16 states have actually passed all the elements. Passing this bill would permit Missouri to have some of the strongest protections to those infants who do survive an abortion. This bill was referred to committee with no further action taken last session. However, this session, it was pre-filed by 3 different legislators, including Representative Coleman, who is the chair of the Children and Families Committee. Next slide. Briefly, there are a couple of bills filed about food assistance programs, such as work requirements for SNAP eligibility and extended the use of SNAP at farmers markets to 2033. Additionally, House Bill 652 expands the farmers market program to include WIC participants as well. Missouri is one of the few states that does not permit WIC participants to participate in the farmers market program. This voted to pass in committee hearing last session. And lastly, there are really no science-related bills pertaining to senior disabled citizens or veterans at the moment. 2 House Joint Resolution bills currently related to tax assessments and exemptions have been filed. Specific to note is Senate Bill 120, though. It's sponsored by Senator White, and it adds provisions relating to military affairs and veterans. It was introduced last session, and it made it to the governor's desk, but was vetoed mainly because of the section relating to the State Department of Defense. And so the government supported most of the bill, so it's very likely to pass with the Department of Defense section removed. And I'll take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Jill. We do have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has questions about children, families, seniors policies for Dr. Barnes.
This is Barbara Shaw. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
What is the probability? What do you see as which of these bills has a high probability of actually getting passed and implemented?
I think the one with the highest probability right now is going to be about the childcare facilities in regards to the registration, just because it's been a really big issue in the last couple of years, and it's really been brought to light, especially with social media and the news. And so there's been a lot of push for changes to occur within how we operate our childcare facilities.
What do you think the chances are for some of the ones that affect SNAP?
I believe the one that would have the most effect on SNAP, actually, the one that I think that has the most ability to be passed is going to be about the WIC participants. In regards to SNAP, I would like to see that they would extend the use for farmers markets to 2033. The bills surrounding work requirements, I'm not sure how those are going to fare, especially with COVID right now and people losing their jobs and things of that nature, how that's going to really impact SNAP eligibility if we have such strict work requirements.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Jill? We do have another minute or so. So maybe I will go ahead. Let's move on to Josh, Dr. Mueller. And if you do have questions for Jill, please feel free to type them in the chat anytime. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Josh Mueller. He's our fellow covering health and mental health policy. And I'll let you have the floor now, Josh.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Rachel. We can go ahead to the next slide and get right into it. Okay, so one thing I want to note right up front here as I get into the legislation is that these topics are organized kind of by salience. So there's a few hot topic slides right up front. This is not necessarily a commentary on the likelihood of these pieces of legislation actually becoming law, but I think it is an indicator of the likelihood of them being debated and kind of up front in terms of agenda setting. So on that note, one thing that is certainly top of mind right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in relation to this, several different pieces of legislation have been proposed that would modify the authority of local health agencies to implement restrictions on gatherings of kind of different natures here. So there are some that are focused on ensuring that religious entities are not more restricted than any other classes of businesses or institutions. And then there are some that are more general and would do things such as restricting the ability of local powers to implement public health guidance and then instead return those powers to the state. So there's kind of a variety of flavors of legislation in this area, and it's unclear what the final sort of product will look like, but there's a lot of attention being paid. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. Related to this, there's been discussion even leaking over from the special sessions this summer about implementing COVID-19 liability protections for civil penalties for businesses and manufacturers of products related to COVID-19. So again, I think that's something that will be top of mind without necessarily commenting on the likelihood of passage. I did mean to include here as well that there are a few pieces of legislation related to infectious disease writ large that I think are kind of going to be top of the line issues for the General Assembly this year as well. There's a slate of bills from Senators Rader and Razor and Representative Phil Custofanelli related to HIV medication access, and then bills relating to legalizing needle exchange programs in the state, and also a bill from Senator Rader that would lessen criminal penalties for knowingly communicating transmissible disease. Okay, Rachel, yeah, next slide. And so another kind of top of the line issue, I think you can think of these slides as 1A and 1B. These are going to be the top kind of hot topics in health and mental health this session, is Medicaid expansion, which of course was passed by ballot initiative this fall, and then some kind of corresponding potential tweaks to Missouri Health Net, which is the state's Medicaid program. So one piece of legislation that's been filed would relate to work and community engagement requirements for Medicaid eligibility. This is something that's been floated as a way to kind of ensure that certain guidelines are being followed for applicants to the Medicaid program to maintain eligibility. I will note that the state of Arkansas has also enacted similar legislation. They've applied for a waiver for work requirements and are battling this out in federal court right now to litigate the legality of these sorts of clauses. So it's something that may see discussion, but I think also depends a little bit on actions at the federal level. Related to this, there are several bills that would modify provisions regarding Missouri Health Net eligibility. Some standouts would include sort of rollover extending eligibility for children who are already enrolled, and then requiring the state file a waiver if they seek to extend Missouri Health Net eligibility to incarcerated persons. So I think just based on the general budget situation related to COVID, with revenues down, the projections at least of revenues down, I think this will be another hot topic. I think legislators will be looking for kind of cost savings in this area. Okay, next slide, Rachel. And then kind of related, health insurance generally, there are several different approaches to shore up and modify health insurance provisions in the state. So taking down the list here, Senator Razor has introduced a bill that would introduce mental health parity in health insurance coverage, basically removing any quantitative caps on treatment for mental health related conditions. A bill in the Senate has also been introduced to remove restrictions related to antipsychotic medication access. I think this is pertaining specifically to Missouri Health Net recipients. But then there's a bill in the House that would require that private health insurance fall in line with the minimum coverage requirements of the Missouri Health Net. So this would kind of be raising the minimum level of coverage that the private health insurers would be providing the state. And then I also want to note that a bill from Senator Caleb Rowden has been introduced that would put in place protections of state level statutes relating to health insurance in the case that any federal actions are taken that would change regulations or requirements in the states. This is meant to be a safeguard to kind of lock in current state level provisions in case any federal level laws or regulations should be repealed that would change or modify rules in the state. And then something that was mentioned previously that I think will see action, especially in the context of kind of health provider shortages in the state due to COVID-19, or really the trend that has been there that's now being brought to light by the current pandemic conditions, is scope of practice laws and licensure, particularly pertaining to nurses, but not restricted solely to those classes. So there are several bills that have been proposed that would modify scope of practice laws for advanced practice registered nurses. Currently, they're required to enter into collaborative practice agreements to carry out many healthcare functions. And so there are a few different approaches to basically either modify or remove these requirements to allow advanced practice registered nurses to function more like primary care providers. Related to this, there's also a few bills on the docket to modify procedures, kind of expedite processes for professional licensure for, again, a kind of wide class of healthcare providers here, all with the idea that these sorts of actions would help to slightly lessen the effects of the health provider shortage that we're seeing in the state. Okay, and then on the topic of prescription drugs, there are a few different interesting items that I think we'll see the floor this year. So one is a bill from Senator Holly Rader that would help enact a process for creating a statewide prescription drug monitoring program. This is something that's been on the agenda for a few years now, and Missouri is currently the only state in the union that does not have a statewide monitoring program, though St. Louis County does have their own program. So I think this is something that has a high likelihood of seeing discussion this year. And then also there are a few bills related to transparency and cost limits on insulin. So there was an interim committee in, I think, both the Senate and the House on prescription drug pricing last year. So I think it's something that has a lot of members' attention and should be on the docket as well. And then finally, there are a few provisions related to tobacco and marijuana in the state. So a set of bills in the Senate and House would change the legal tobacco purchase age from 18 to 21. This is something that has been enacted in several states around the country. So we'll see if Missouri follows suit. And then legislation has also been introduced to allow localities to modify taxes on tobacco products, which is currently a power that resides with the state. So we'll see if the kind of local control perspective takes hold there. And then finally, there's been several bills, including a joint resolution that would modify the state constitution to legalize recreational cannabis consumption for adults in the state. So this is something that has been passed in Illinois, our neighbor, and then several other states around the country. So we'll see if this makes it to the floor as well. I believe those are all the issues I have. So I'm happy to pause and take any questions there might be.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I do think we have time for one question. If anybody has one, feel free to type it in the chat, or you can go ahead and say it out loud. So I don't see anything coming across the chat. So perhaps we can go ahead and move on to Eleni's presentation. If you do have questions for Josh, please feel free to type them in the chat anytime. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Eleni Bickel. She covers agriculture, natural resources and conservation, and economic development.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eleni Bickel. Thank you so much for tuning in today. All of the fellows, all of the team is really excited to show some of the work that we have been doing over the last few months and specifically over the last few weeks. Thanks, Rachel, for the introduction. I'm the Agricultural, Natural Resources and Conservation and Economic Development Fellow. Next slide, please. Some of the committees that I cover are the Agriculture, Food Production, Natural Resources Committee at the Senate, the Economic Development Committee, the Conservation, Natural Resources, and the Agricultural Policy Committees at the House. For the special committees, I have the Joint Committee on Agriculture, where we have a mixed membership from both the Senate and the House. Also, I have the Subcommittee on Appropriations on Agriculture, Conservation, Natural Resources, and Economic Development, and of course, the Special Committee on Tourism. Now, even though all of the fellows have a specific niche, where each of us, as you already saw, covers specific areas of science and research and legislation, even within our niches, there is a lot of different areas that we have to cover. So in my presentation, I'm going to give a really big picture of the bills because of time, and I'm going to show you just the 6 of the areas that I have been seeing some of the bills. So on the food area, we have seen 3 big bills that specifically target the problems that we have in our state with food deserts. 3 of the states specifically want to establish a tax credit for urban farms. 2 of them from the House, 1 from the House and 1 from the Senate, want to establish this credit for the urban farms that are established, and 1 of them to establish a tax credit for grocery stores in food deserts. Another bill that we saw recently is the establishment of allowing cottage food production being sold over the internet. Another one, again, on the same area is allowing public schools and higher education institutions to donate any unused food that they might have to specific farms. And a bill that has been pre-filed, two bills that have been pre-filed from both the House and the Senate, is something that we have seen over the last few years. It's about being able to sell raw milk or cream in Missouri as long as there's a clear labeling that the milk is raw. Then on the economic development area, I have been watching closely 5 bills in total. 2 of the ones that seem like they're going to be moving along are first exemptions on the retail food of sale of food that are going to be established specifically on the supplement and nutrition assistance program for the SNAP food. But also one of the bills is going to be prohibiting local governments from regulating home-based businesses. Then the third area that I cover has to do with animals and animal welfare, and we have seen a lot of bills being pre-filed all the way from December, and they specifically talk about animal abuse. One of them establishes an animal abuse registry. Another one increases the penalties for animal abusers, and we also have seen that there's a lot of legislation being filed, even on not just on animals on the farms and animals in general, but also on household pets. And we also have seen that if pet food is going to be used in the United States and it comes from another nation, then there will be an establishment of mandatory labeling, where they will have to state the type of food, the type of ingredients that there are in that food. Then one piece of one research topic area that we haven't seen this year yet being filed, but a legislator has asked us to prepare some information for them, is on the concentrated animal feeding facilities. And the last time that we saw something on that area was in 2019. Then on the natural resources and conservation realm, I have about 8 bills. The biggest bill that you're probably going to be hearing about has to do with the modifications on the provision that we already have relating to feral swine. Now, if you are in that area, you probably have heard about this topic being referred to as the feral hogs. This year we see a little turn of terminology, but it's basically about the same topic. Both the House and the Senate have filed bills about the economic provisions. Basically, if somebody is capturing feral swine on their farm or their land, who is going to be responsible for the damage that is being caused by these animals? Then on the big area of agriculture, the farms and the land, I have some bills that I wanted to show you today. One of them two of them come both from the House and the Senate. One of them is filed by the last session's chair of Agricultural Policy Committee, Representative Don Ron, and it basically changes the provisions of governing and owning foreign ownership of agriculture-related businesses and agricultural land. Then we see also a bill that was also moving forward last year, but due to COVID, a lot of this legislation didn't move forward. So it's again here on this legislation this year. It has to do with the modifications on which companies, which private and public utilities can use the term eminent domain. Then a bill that is, I think, we don't have a lot of information about this. We will see it later, but I think has some sort of link with the eminent domain, is the bill 181 from the House, and it modifies computation of heritage value in condemnation proceedings. And condemnation proceedings, if you're familiar with that, is basically an alternative language for using eminent domain. So those two are probably related. And another bill that was filed earlier this month is by Representative Kent Hayden, and it basically establishes a number of entities, and only those entities will be able to inspect farms and ranch facilities in our state. Then on the last big picture area that I wanted to show to you today is the area of energy, fueling, and transportation. Probably the biggest bill that you're going to see in this area is the so-called biodiesel bill. This bill is establishing a minimum biodiesel fuel content mandate. And basically what that means is that starting from next spring, if this bill becomes a law, then you're going to see that every biodiesel gas station is going to have, every diesel gas station is going to have a biodiesel minimum fuel content. And that's going to start from 5% all the way to 20% by 2024. And then the last bill that I wanted to mention is reauthorizing the wood energy tax credit, which was already in place, but just expired this June. And now with this bill that was introduced, it's going to be extended to the 2027. And now that's all I have for you. I'm open and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Eleni. We do have one question related to the eminent domain bill. So Casey asked, does the bill on eminent domain for utility purposes have implications for broadband?
Perhaps it does. Specifically about this specific, it could have if it passes, I believe, my personal opinion. However, specifically the bill talks about private public utilities that have to do, that want to establish transmission lines above the ground, specifically for energy purposes. So as for this point, I don't think it directly impacts it, but I think if it does become a law, I think that's definitely going to impact how future companies make all these negotiations, because basically what this bill will say is that unless you're a public utility company or unless you're a cooperative or other provisions, you're not allowed to go ahead and use eminent domain whenever you want to get some land to build your transmission lines. But I do want to mention that we have written a science note on this. So after our session, please feel free and go and read that science note. It's pretty brief and it has a lot of information, more information about this.
Thanks, Eleni. There were actually two questions related to the eminent domain. And so I think that you answered both. And then there's also a question, can you comment, just a sec. Can you comment further on the CAFO research that you were asked to provide? And that will be on our website here shortly, but maybe Eleni, you can summarize it here quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Well, like I mentioned, we don't have any legislation so far, but we do see that the legislators are interested, specifically legislators who don't live close to farms. The legislator who requested this note was very honest in a sense that he didn't know a lot about agriculture and he lives in a city. So every information that he gets is going to be, from other people. It's not going to be from farmers. And he asked that we could provide some information that has to do also with the farm interest, but also with the companies and also the residents who live in those areas that have KFOs. Some information, if you can be a little bit more specific about what you want to know about KFOs, I'll be happy to give a little bit more. What specifically would you like to know?
Eleni, to clarify, there's no bills that are currently being introduced on KFOs. This was more of the senator was asking for general information, so that way he could respond to some information he was getting from his constituents. Is that correct?
Yep. So far, we only have some developments that happened on a local level, like county level, only as a response to the 2019 last law that we saw on KFOs. The last law that we saw, the last law in this area was about freeing the regulation around KFOs. And until at that point, you had the local health authorities being responsible for any KFOs and what type of restrictions they had. They were responsible. Now with the last bill that we saw in 2019, the responsibility for that is not going to be set on those authorities. And it's going to be more likely that we might see more KFOs around the state. Like Rachel mentioned, we're going to be uploading that note today at some point. So you're going to be able to see a lot on that area from that science note as well.
Thanks, Eleni. There are a couple more questions coming in for you. If you can look in the chat and maybe answer those as we go into Jenny's presentation, I do want to make sure that Jenny has time. And I think that Jenny will be covering a little bit of climate change aspects of bills. And so I will go ahead and give it to Jenny now. So Dr. Jenny Bradford is a fellow who covers energy, environment, transportation, and public safety. So she has quite a broad portfolio, but I think she is summarizing all of those areas pretty well today. So Jenny, you can go ahead and start.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Let's get right into it. Move to the next slide. So energy. There's going to be a lot of topics. Eleni touched on a couple of these related to energy with the eminent domain that potentially affects the transmission line for the Grain Belt Express, as well as sort of biodiesel. I'm going to touch on a few others. And one theme that emerges a lot here is how is it getting paid for? So the first thing that, Rachel, if you just want to click along as I'm talking, the first thing is for securitization, which is basically a process that allows the energy companies to foreclose on certain facilities. This has generated a lot of interest because right now renewable energy is pretty cheap. There's also other cheaper, like natural gas is pretty cheap. And they're all better in some ways environmentally than coal is. And so there's a lot of convergence of interest around energy companies want to be able to move away from coal and go to cheaper energy. It's the ratepayers potentially end up paying less. And then from the environmental side, it's, an ability to close down these coal plants faster. So that's one thing to watch out for there. There's a couple of bills related to solar. So one of these is from Eric Burleson to stop any sort of like municipal or homeowner limits on rooftop solar installation. So more people are able to install solar. The other is, the other would add fees for customer generated solar. So this is generally looked at as sort of inhibiting solar potentially. This is known as Net Metering and Easy Connection Act. So something to watch out for there is how you either get charged or not for solar. And then finally, there's an interesting bill from John Black about construction costs for nuclear. Specifically, this bill would allow the construction cost to be shifted to the ratepayers for any kind of renewable or low carbon energy generating facility. And so the potential downside here is more cost for ratepayers. So those are kind of conversations that are being had with regards to energy. So next we can talk about the environment. So a theme that emerges a lot here is where the authority is. So yeah, if you wanna, okay, yeah. So for example, do people have the authority to sue on behalf of nature? There's a bill here to say that no, you can't sue on behalf of nature. Nature doesn't have rights. There's another bill out to ban asbestos, which previously had a lot of criticism that it didn't protect those who were exposed enough. Some of those critics have been termed out, so we'll see that might potentially be going through. There's a couple of water-related bills. One is for related to a private water, very large private water companies, which is basically Missouri American Water, allowing them to sort of adjust their rates outside of the typical rate cases. And another is related to sort of DNR rules on ammonia at water facilities. So this is kind of related to that theme I was talking about earlier. How are we managing these costs? And then in terms of authority, again, we have some bills that are introduced for hazardous waste. Again, from Burleson, he actually has two bills related to this to sort of prevent any additional state rules on top of what federal rules there already are, and also potentially reducing fees there. And then on the flip side, we have Ingrid Burnett's bill to allow municipalities to have the authority to ban plastic bags. So again, it's sort of looking at who has the authority. Can we give them the authority to sort of do what we want or not? So that's kind of a theme that emerges here for the environment. Okay, public safety. So one thing, I've had the committees here listed out. One thing that's different this year is that the House has split the Committee on Crime Prevention and Public Safety into two committees. I'll just point that out. And then public safety is really interesting for anybody who's doing research into this topic, because they are exploring just about every idea you can imagine. So the one bill I'll highlight in particular that's gotten a lot of press is Brian Williams' Senate Bill 60 for law enforcement reform. So you can see here it does a lot of things that have been talked about in the news, limiting no-knock warrants, limiting use of force, requiring de-escalation training, prohibiting chokeholds, requiring reports on excessive force, and requiring written policies on officer-involved shootings. And I wanted to also mention that there's like House bills for each of those like individual topics too. So there's a lot of interest here. There are also even more potential reforms being discussed, including body cameras, having a commission on that or requiring those. There's a couple of bills related to pre-employment screenings of police officers, having like a database there, as well as more protections against unlawful searches or discriminatory searches. Finally, related to police, there's a couple of bills designed to protect police officers from investigations and give them more rights. One of them is called the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. So kind of coming from more protecting the police standpoint. And then I thought I should also mention for public safety, there are 36 firearm related bills, 16 that expand gun rights, 8 that sort of restrict them in different ways. I can talk a bit about that more if any people are interested. So then transportation. So sort of in contrast to what we're seeing with public safety, where there's a lot of sort of new ideas, some of these ideas have been going around for a long time in transportation. So that includes increasing the gas tax. So notably, there's a couple bills actually being led by David Schatz, who's the president pro tem. So we have leadership interested in increasing the gas tax, which hasn't been increased in Missouri, I think, in about 20 years. Basically raising it 10 cents over 5 years to get it more in line with our neighboring states. This is kind of important for the state of our infrastructure and how we afford next infrastructure developments. There's also a bill to prohibit texting while driving. This is only illegal right now for people that are under the age 21. And there's a couple of related bills that are more or less restrictive on texting or usage of phone while driving. And then next, okay, this is the last one here. Broadband, we had a question come up about broadband, and this is definitely a huge topic. We're doing this session online right now. And so there's a couple of bills to help sort of municipalities expand their ability to create broadband, as well as, this might have been what people were talking about in the chat before. There's 2 bills that are related to electrical companies and giving them the authority to operate broadband services. Many of these electrical companies, they already have sort of these fiber lines for their own sort of internal usage. And right now they would have to ask for the property owners. They're not going to build anything new, but they would still have to go through the process of eminent domain and ask for those rights to use it for a different use. And this would sort of allow them to use it for broadband for the public as a service. So with that, I can take any questions.
Thanks, Jenny. We did have a comment from Holly Neal that House Bill 369 and Senate Bill 301, the Prescribed Fire Act, is another bill that is on everyone's radar and has some more direct connections to climate. Thanks, Holly. I think there's some people on this call who probably are having close contact with lawmakers. And so if there's bills that we've missed and should have on our radar, please feel free to let us know.
Yeah. And I should clarify, thanks, Josh. The utilities are not looking to operate broadband, just get it to the last mile and hand it off to the provider, but they still need the authority to do that.
Thanks, Josh. So if you have questions for Jenny, you can go ahead and type them into the chat, but I want to turn it over to Dan English and just give him a few minutes here to talk about sort of what you can do with this information if you would like to elevate some of these scientific topics in policy conversations during the 2021 legislative session.
Thanks, Rachel. Kind of the reason that we're here is to give you the power to empower people like you to engage in to engage in the public discourse and to elevate the discourse around science in some of these bills, and to engage with our most fellows and engage with state and local lawmakers. I want to see if I can share my screen here. There we go. This is our engagement platform, Missouri, LSEN.quorum.us. Rachel, if I could get you to write that web address into the chat. One of the ways to stay up to date on all these bills right here is to make sure I think you're all probably signed up for this, but make sure you go down here to the bottom where you see Missouri LSEN Science Priorities. You can click each to be notified when new bills related to these science priorities are identified and introduced, when they move to committee, when they're open for public comment. So if you're interested in climate change, so anything related to climate change, we mentioned prescribed burning earlier, we can click that and make sure that's updated on your profile. If you're already signed into that, just go up here to the top right corner of the screen. This is what the screen looks like right now when there's nobody, when you're not signed up for our program. But there's a link here to update all your preferences. Other than that, keep up to date for our upcoming events. Today is our legislative outlook, so that's still on here. Coming up, we have some roundtable discussions concerning vaccine equity. This month, next month, we hope to have a roundtable discussion on climate change and many more programs throughout the course of this next year. So if you are interested in being a part of those, if you are interested in contributing, reach out to me. If you're interested in reviewing science notes for any one of our most fellows, reach out to me and I'll make sure to connect you. Whatever you're interested, I don't want to take up too much time here because we're just about out of time. Be sure to reach out to me. I will connect you, and we'll get the show on the road.
Thanks, Dan. I'll just put up our contact information here for the last slide. And if you have any questions, we can take those. If not, we invite you to join our upcoming events. We'll keep you notified when some of these bills are going to be coming across committees. Like Jill said, there are some bills scheduled for hearings this week in the Children and Families Committees that we'll make sure we post on the quorum site. And we also will have our fellowship applications coming up. So if you are a PhD level scientist interested in doing the work that our fellows are doing this year, look for those opening up this Friday. Any questions? I think we're right at time, actually. Yeah. So maybe I will go ahead and wrap things up. Yes, so I will answer the question about contact information. So if you go to our website and click on About Us and Most Staff, you can see all of our emails. But in general, they're all our first name at mostpolicyinitiative.org.
And if you want to check out this presentation again, we are recording it and we will put it up on the mostpolicyinitiative.org website sometime pretty soon. We'll let you know.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.